Weapon of War. Part 1. Chapter 1. Time log. 5 years later. My fellow confidants, there once was a time, not too long Weapon of War. Part 1. Chapter 1. Time log. 5 years later. My fellow confidants, there once was a time, not too long ago, where our organization was seen as a joke. A deplorable belief that was bounded by all. A radical idea that was expected to fail. They thought of us as weak, inferior, something they could look down at, something they could laugh at. But look at us now, my brothers. Not only did we persevere through these troubled times, but we also rose above expectations and defied all odds. This defining war has given us all the necessities that our organization has so greatly desired. Now people fear us. They flee and cower at our dynamism. However, we must not think too highly of ourselves. We have not reached even close to the apex of this great campaign. There is still another defining area currently outside our grasp that we could control. Space and time. Imagine if we could bend the cosmos and do as we please. It is no longer just science fiction. It is possible. It is achievable. And with all the resources we have acquired, it is ours for the taking. Think, we could easily send that fatuous, rebellious group Corensori straight to the depths of oblivion. We could conquer this world in our image. We could conquer all of the universe. So, my patient followers of this new age, do you believe in what I, your one true speaker, say? This new race, this new way of life, can only happen if we all work together as one chosen unit. To Diadem, he pounded his fist 2 times onto the bureau in front of him, and then placed the palm of his hand horizontally across his forehead. To Diadem, repeated the others around the table, pounding their fists 2 times and returning salute, before standing and applauding. Everyone around the table then sat down, except the speaker who continued his moving speech. There were 24 in attendance at the meeting table, including the speaker. The dark chamber they occupied was a confined room with only one exit. There were no light fixtures in the chamber, albeit from the table which somehow gave off an unnatural emerald glow. The shine was just enough for each person to see the other's face, with a majority of illumination directed towards the speaker. The members varied in both stature of size and official rank, save for 2 commonalities. The first was that each was completely shaven. None had head hair, facial hair, or even eyebrows. Above their eyes, from right to left, was their barcode identification number, or bin. Each man had 6 numbers in their bin, except for the speaker, who had 5. The second commonality was that every man was wearing the same white uniform. There were differences in imprint, most likely to signify rank, but the style of clothing appeared to be identical. Each wore a long white coat, white slacks, white gloves, and white dress shoes. The combination of 24 men in full uniform, with only one exit and little air ventilation, created a stifling, humid climate in the meeting chamber. One of the larger gentlemen grabbed his white handkerchief from his coat and patted his forehead, which glistened in the verdant light. He then grabbed a glass of water and desperately drank it down as his spectacles began to fog. He took them off and rubbed them gently with his sweaty handkerchief, trying to examine them the best he could in the awkward lighting. He raised them up towards the ceiling. Just as he did, he noticed a glare in the vent. However, he didn't say anything. All he did was put his glasses back on and stare. After a few seconds, he came to the conclusion that it was nothing but a trick of the mind, so he looked back towards the speaker and listened attentively. What the fuck is all this bullshit? There was someone in the vent. It was a young man who looked to be around the age of 20 to 25. Tightly packed in his metal coffin, he peered through the slits of the ventilation grill while recording the meeting on a small video device in his left hand. Dust tickled his nose, and his elbows were long past numb, but he kept the camera steady on the speaker's stern and sullen face. The wrinkles on the speaker were exaggerated by the green glow, and the man in the vent felt that he was recording the discovery of some horrible mummy. While the man focused down below, a curious rat appeared behind him, and instead of squeezing around, the rat decided to crawl up on top of him to reach the other side. The man in the vent could feel and hear it bruxing near his ear but ignored it. He marketed himself as a trained and professional spy after all. After a quick power grooming, the rat continued on its way, touching back down on the other side of the vent. It began to scurry away but stopped and returned sniffing towards the man. It closed in cautiously as it sniffed at the man's right-hand pinky finger before biting down hard. The man held in the urge to curse and tried to hit the fleeing rat, but the sudden movement shifted dust around him, and he was snared by the urge to sneeze. Unfortunately, at the same time, everyone in the meeting below was taking a moment of silence to reflect and think, when the professional spy in the vent let out a long and loud sneeze, mixed with a sharp flatulence and the word fuck. The speaker opened his eyes. Did you hear that? The rest of the men opened their eyes and stared at him. Each nodded to the other. It came from up in the vent, one said aloud. The man grew tense in the vent and held his breath. The speaker's right-hand man leaned over and whispered, "Should we call the guards?" With a crooked smile, he whispered back, "Not yet. I want to fish him out. Go turn on the heaters, full blast." The right-hand man got up from his seat. Everyone stared at him attentively. Slowly he began to turn knobs on a panel near the exit. Satisfied with the selections, the right-hand man returned without a word to his chair. Each man sat and sweated profusely while patiently staring up at the vent as minutes passed. As the temperature rose and the metal vent began to heat, the spy tried to make his exit quickly, but realized he could not push forwards or backwards. "Shit, I think I'm in trouble." The professional spy had become unprofessionally stuck. Finally, the heat became too much for him to bear. There was only one option now. He curled up against the vent for support and kicked the metal grill he had been spying through. A second kick rattled through the air. Then, with the third kick, the grill dislodged and plummeted 20 feet to the floor below, bouncing on impact and flying out of sight. "Call the guards," the speaker whispered. The right-hand man acknowledged his order, got up, walked towards the exit, turned off the heat, and withdrew from the room. The remaining 22 men stood up and also vacated the room, aware that they would simply be in the way. The man in the vent dove out into the open. He executed a front flip before spreading his arms. His coat opened, in what looked to be an attempt to reduce the speed of his free fall. Leaving one leg out, he was prepared to try to regain balance the second of impact, and for a split second, it appeared as if a fallen angel was descending onto the room. He hit the ground rather nicely and rose to his feet, while 20 guards stormed the room, forming 2 circles around him. Each guard was clad in a black uniform. The man was unsure if they were bald like the others, because each soldier also donned a black combat helmet with a protruding dark visor. They stood motionless, awaiting further orders while holding their M16A1 rifles in the collapse low-ready position. He looked around at them and their weapons and smiled, almost demonically, at the hopeful prospect of carnage. The speaker stepped into the circle without uttering a word or command. He silently examined the trespasser from head to toe. The interloper had dark brown hair that was wild, yet not convoluted. A pair of what looked like ordinary sand goggles were secured on his forehead and kept his semi-long hair from getting into his eyes. The rest of his attire was hidden under his long dark coat, which draped from shoulder to shoulder. The speaker stared into his dark blue eyes for a moment while the room was frozen in absolute silence. He chortled as the crooked smile once again washed over his face. "Well, we're all so glad you could drop in, dear stranger. But please, pray tell, how and why you ended up in our ventilation system. What were you doing up there?" "Nothing, just hanging around. I like dirty spaces," the man smiled back as he analyzed the speaker's bin. 43784. "Come now. We are both men who could solve this in a non-violent way." The man laughed. "You don't get it. I like violence." I see, so you're a primitive ape. Pity. You know what? Fuck you, you fucking old piece of shit. The man tightened his fists and both of them lost their carefree smiles. Yes, I see. Well, I am honored to be called Hurdy, the one true speaker. Even though it's clear to see, from the look of your head of hair, you have yet to join the one true amalgamation, you must have heard of me. Nope. Can't say that I have. The man seemed more focused on picking his ear and flicking whatever gunk came out to the ground. Well, you should do good to remember it. There, I have told you my name. Surely, you can tell me yours. Well, holding this word mockingly, I don't normally do this. Some believe that if I say anything, it sort of kind of is a breach of confidentiality, you know? These guys don't look too kindly at that thing. But hey, fuck that, right? I'll tell ya, but it's only 'cause you amuse me so much, ya old mummy man. Name's Scott. Do good to remember it. I see, so you decided to not be renamed after the war. That is a brave, but foolish move. And I am to be addressed as Hurdy, the one true speaker. Yeah, whatever you say, Squirty, the dick that squeaka. So, can I go now? Scott looked at the guards. Tell me what you were doing up there this instant. Hurdy's voice was becoming strict, but Scott could care less. You wanna know? Fine. How the fuck could it possibly hurt to give away all my secrets, right? I was recording your conversation with these fat fucks here for some dough. And by how fucking boring the stupid shitty speech and meeting was, I probably hit jackpot on the fucking market. Scott beamed with joyous insolence. My, you have a filthy mouth. Yeah, well, what can I say? It's just the way I am. I see. Hurdy presented the palm of his hand. Scott, I have a compassionate proposition for you. Give me the recording and we may just let you leave with your life. And if not, the guards here will shoot until I tell them to stop. Hurdy snapped his finger twice in time, signaling, ready up. On the imaginary third beat, in perfect uniformity, each guard braced by bending their knees slightly, pushed the stock of the rifle into their shoulder, slightly rotated the assault rifle to the left while reaching over with their left hand to cock it, brought the weapon back to a vertical position and up to eye level, rested their cheek on the stock, aimed down their sight at Scott, and finished the movement by disengaging the safety with their thumb. This all occurred and was executed exactly as the imaginary fourth beat struck. They waited, frozen with trigger discipline. For safety, the guards could not fire while Hurdy was still in the circle unless he commanded it, or Scott initiated it by brandishing a weapon. You know, I was thinking that was a cool little color guard trick there by the way. I was thinking that I'll actually take option C, getting the fuck out of here with my tape. Scott seamlessly sprinted to the exit side of the circle while finishing his dialogue, catching Hurdy off guard. He jumped effortlessly in the air, and just as he hit his zenith, Scott clicked his heels together. There was a small explosion from the bottom of his boots, which gave him a slight boost and almost propelled him over the second circle. He came down and landed on a guard's face that was looking upwards and quickly bounced off. The explosion, and that Hurdy was no longer a potential casualty, gave the guards permission to engage. They turned around towards the runner and opened fire on him as he escaped through the door. Scott managed to clear the exit without being hit, and the bullets could not pierce through the blast walls that surrounded the room. By casus, find him and kill him. I want to watch his body burn. Now, Hurdy ordered. The guards were now free to sprint after Scott and engage until stopped, but he was already a great deal down the hallway and had gone around a corner. He was not wearing combat armor or maneuvering a two-handed weapon as he ran. Scott couldn't help but notice that the interior of the hall was very dull. Only one color for the ceiling, the walls, and the floor, white. Hello? What's all this then? He muttered to himself with an awkward attempt at what could only be assumed was a British accent of some kind. Scott stopped at a chute. He wasn't sure what it was used for, and it felt so cliché like some poorly written, B-rated, story by a teenager, but he could hear the guards approaching and taking aim, so he did the only sensible thing and leapt in face first. He kept gaining speed as he went from floor to floor. It seemed as though the chute was somehow endless. After about a minute of sliding, or it might have just been 6 seconds, Scott shot out of the chute onto the ground and smashed his face into the floor. Fucking piece of shit. Why? He yelled so loudly that anybody in an earshot could hear. Scott quickly hopped back to his feet and began to run down the hall. It looked exactly the same as the floor that was, he believed, hundreds of stories above him. He ran past identical room after identical room until one caught his eye. Flying Crafts 306. Well, hello there. What kind of toys you guys getting me for my birthday? He quipped to himself while kicking the door down and running inside. There was only one craft in the whole area, but she looked primed and ready to be flown. This'll have to do, Scott stepped in. The craft was a YT-99. Not as big as the RX-123 or the MJ-50, its wings only spanned 25 feet. Only old professional craft builders or enthusiasts could hope to operate them successfully because only 109 still existed in the world. With this now obsolete design, the loss of size would guarantee speed exponentially. They were deadly to all, especially the pilot. Pushing his back against the seat, while flipping the ignition switch, Scott was instantaneously launched down the short runway, straight through a hatch, and out of the compound. As the craft effortlessly changed from climbing to cruising, a realization took hold and Scott thanked everything holy that the hatch he exited through just happened to be open. He forgot to check before taking off. 30 seconds had passed since he took flight, and Scott could feel the adrenaline begin to pass. He engaged the autopilot and sat back with his eyes closed, patting the inner left pocket of his jacket to confirm that he still had the tape. A red light began to blink on the control panel, but went unnoticed until the second stage emergency was activated, and a loud screech shook him awake. Faster than he could sit upright, the craft was struck with heavy firepower and began to shake violently. Scott fought to maintain control, while simultaneously thinking of his next 2 steps. The first and obvious conclusion was, there was no way he could take another hit like that. With a glance he assessed that he was dumping fuel at an alarming rate. The YT-99 was infamous for not having reserves. The next assessment he could feel by his hands, his vertical stabilizer had been slightly damaged. Not great to lose precise control of yaw, but at least the horizontal stabilizer seemed fine. He looked behind him. 2 YT-99s were attempting to close the gap, and with the damage of their first hit, he knew it was less than a minute before he would easily be in their fire range. He tried to ready the craft's armament, but saw they were not only offline, but had no ammunition loaded at all. Scott cursed to himself. Of course, this was their plan all along, and he fell right into it. Either they were very cunning, or Scott was very basic. Scott's mind immediately shoved this thought away for the more pressing reality. He could not outrun, maneuver, or even shoot and fight, but he still had a chance. It was a pathetically low chance, but Scott had worked with less. Reaching down the side of his left boot, he pulled out a small disc. The glossy white object shimmered in the sunset. No, he had no time for poetic ramblings. He held it out with his left hand, and with 2 clockwise rotations of his right index finger, the disc now read 15. Every second mattered now. He secured the emergency flight helmet, while again thanking Lady Luck it was right where it was supposed to be. He then made sure the belts of the safety harness were latched and tight. Next, he increased the speed of the craft to roughly 300 knots, 555 kilometers per hour, or 345 miles per hour. Finally, he frantically, but also expertly, typed in some commands to the autopilot, removed the plastic backing of the disc, exposing the adhesive underneath, and then slapped the disc down on the control column. The slap activated the micro-explosive, and it was now armed. As the timer began to count down, he leaned over slightly and tried to peer over the side. The town below him was destroyed. A messed up old shitslum town that was located next to the mirth factories. The pollution was unimaginable, but hey, it's home. Scott counted down in his mind. He tried to be roughly 1.5 seconds ahead of the countdown. His hands rested on the control column, next to where he had placed the disc. He could feel the other crafts were just seconds from being on top of him. 5. Scott could see the red light start to blink. He exhaled. 4. Scott disengaged the angle of attack limiter, which simultaneously disengaged the G limiter. He inhaled. 3. Scott gripped the control column as his knuckles turned white and clenched his buttocks and legs. He exhaled. 2. With all his might, Scott took a deep breath inwards with his mouth open and trapped the air in his glottis. He straightened his back against the seat and prepared for brief pain. The impact alarm trigger screeched hopelessly. 1. Scott pulled back hard on the control column and watched the angle of attack rise steadily up to 100 degrees. The green interior of the fuselage began to dim only slightly as Scott felt a sudden force of 4G. His aircraft rose in altitude while simultaneously bled speed. For a moment, he felt suspended in air and frozen in time. The missiles, which had been fired at him, careened under his craft and continued forward into the distance. Scott activated the autopilot and let go of the control column. The last preparation. Not exactly the Cobra maneuver that the Swedes or Russians would have been proud to see, but he got what he needed from it. The gap between him and the two pursuers was now closed, and they began to overshoot, caught off guard by this unexpected stunt. His craft began to stall and drop slightly back to the original altitude as the autopilot scrambled to fix his mess. Scott let the air in his throat out with a loud K. He immediately took another breath with his mouth open grabbed the ejector handle with both hands, tightened his glutes and legs again, and yanked the handle, initiating bailout as he prepared his spine and body for true pain. Ejection. The canopy blew off and was instantly jettisoned away. While this occurred, and before Scott's brain could even register, restraints held him in place against the seat, protecting him from losing limbs as his seat shot up the railing and prepared for catapult. The sounds of explosions deafened him. The flash of explosions blinded him. The sudden jerking disoriented him. It was only if Scott regained his senses, he would know his plan worked. 0.15 seconds after ejection. Scott was then catapulted from the aircraft at roughly 50 feet, or 15 meters, a second. His body experienced 20 G of force, making him momentarily feel the pressure of 3,800 pounds, or 1,724 kilos, knocking the air out of his body and potentially snapping his spine. He wouldn't know the result for another 2 to 4 seconds. To the two pilots pursuing Scott, they could do nothing but watch him fly off in the opposite direction of their travel. The rockets attached to his seat took over, sending him another 200 feet away from the next step in his plan. 0.5 to 0.52 seconds after ejection. Scott's seat began to decouple itself from his equipment. He and the seat, though no longer attached, still traveled together, away from the crafts, until Scott's parachute automatically released. 2.5 seconds after ejection. Being under 15,000 feet, the drogue parachute did not deploy. The main parachute fully opened, and Scott was finally lifted out of his seat, which at this point had begun its descent to Earth. Scott's vision was the first sense to return, and he could see 3 blurry objects tangled in an inferno. His sense of sound followed soon after, and he could hear the fiery wreckage exploding as all 3 crafts plunged to the ground below. Then, Scott could feel the heat of the explosion fade away. Lastly, Scott could smell, and even taste the smoke which he knew would linger in his clothes. He checked that he could move his arms and kick his legs, and then took control of the parachute, maneuvering it to a motel nearby. He was relieved that even this part had timed out just as he had planned. As he glided, he wished he could have somehow kept the YT-99, but maybe someday. There should still be 106 chances left. The approach to his destination was well calculated, and he was well prepared. However, due to the previous events, he was unable to control his landing properly, and he hit the ground, knocking the wind out of him as he rolled to a stop. He mumbled whatever words, curse or not, that came to mind as his body slowly regained control. Scott got to his feet, detached his parachute, and threw off the helmet he had forgotten he was wearing. He patted and brushed dirt off his coat, brushed his hands on his pants, and did small jumps while slapping himself in the face slightly. Then he walked forward and through the door of the stairwell, stopping only for a moment to check the tape. He still had it, and as if by magic, both of them were somehow still in one piece. He quickly walked down 3 flights of stairs until he reached the 2nd floor from the bottom. Slowly walking past the rooms, he examined the numbers till he stopped at room 208. He knocked 3 times in succession, waited, then knocked 3 times again. There was no answer. He knocked again on the door with the same pattern. Again, there was no answer. He began to just pound on the door. "Hey Charlie, it's me. Open the door." No answer. God damn it. He tried the knob, but it was locked. He kicked the door in frustration and turned around, running his hands down his face with a long exhale. The fuck is he doing? Taking a shit? As he turned to go down the hallway towards the front desk, the door opened slightly with a soft creak. Puzzled, Scott opened it slowly with his left hand. As the light from the hall permeated the residence, Scott could see that there had been some kind of altercation. Charlie's books were ripped apart near a bookshelf that was knocked over. The 2 beds and their pillows were stabbed at and ripped to shreds. The television was shot at and thrown across the room. The desk, which held valuable information, was flipped over and all of its contents were strewn onto the floor. "Fuck," Scott whispered. "Charlie? You in here?" Scott flipped the light switch. It did not respond. Scott entered as he drew his secondary and began searching for his partner. Immediately, he caught the sounds of a soft moan from under the bookshelf that had been toppled over. He holstered his weapon and lifted the heavy object back into a standing position. His partner laid motionless on the ground, still slightly buried by books and pages. Scott knelt down, removed all the clutter, and quickly assessed the situation. Even in the limited lighting, he could see Charlie's rich, long blonde hair was soaked in blood. His green eyes were swollen and black. His shirt had been violently ripped off and was by his side. There was a gunshot wound in his left leg and right shoulder. He had various bruises covering his face and chest. Also on his chest was a long diagonal cut which slowly let out blood. He had been tortured and left for dead. "Shit. Charlie." Scott touched him. He was still alive, but very cold and probably wouldn't make it to the next hour without help. Scott was about to take off his coat to cover his friend when he heard a sound come from behind him. A shadow emerged from the closet. As it stepped into frame, the ambient light revealed a stocky man with a Glock 17 gripped in his hand. Scott could smell the gunpowder and knew instantly that this was the culprit responsible for Charlie's wounds. Pathetic fool didn't even put up a fight. "I wish all jobs were this easy." The man had a deep, throaty voice. His platinum blonde hair seemed to radiate a light of its own, and his dark brown eyes squinted at Scott, as though he was looking at the sun in the darkness. For a moment they silently glared at one another, but Scott knew he didn't have time for games. "You're going to pay for what you did here." Scott's voice darkened unnaturally. As if possessed, he lost all expression and seemed to mystically rise from his knees to feet while rotating towards the intruder. "Really? I would like to see you do that. Or are you just another baby?" The man shot at Scott. The bullet missed and struck the bookshelf, possibly a warning shot to test his fear. Scott remained motionless. His eyes locked solely on his target. A deep velvet red erupted from the lower half of his pupils, while the pure blue of his irises fogged and grayed. "I see, so you aren't a coward. Good, this will be fun." He put his gun up again. Scott could tell this one wouldn't miss. The bullet shot off, and Scott dodged it with ease. It shattered a window as it flew out of the room. The man clenched his jaw in frustration. He shot off another and another, but Scott dodged them all until the magazine was empty and the gun clicked helplessly. He looked at Scott in fear. "What the fuck are you?" He tried to reload his gun, while the color drained from his face. The last person you will ever see, Scott unleashed his weapon. Scott owned and typically used a primary and secondary weapon. His primary was a Magnum Desert Eagle Mark I, a gift from his grandfather on his 18th birthday. His secondary was a Colt Government, which he had purchased during his expedition back to the West Coast. However, both guns were still in their holsters. No, this was something entirely different. This revolver emitted a deep red color which filled the room and somehow seemed to be attached to the inside of Scott's arm, possibly to assist with aim. Scott shot off all 6 rounds in a single moment. The gun made no discernible sound as it fired, but the vibrations shook the walls. Then, as quickly as he had taken it out from hiding, he put it back in a holster somewhere under his coat, and it uncoupled from his arm. The man looked at himself, then confusingly at Scott, and then began to laugh. "I cannot believe you just missed, you fucking hack." The intruder finished loading his gun and began to lift it towards Scott. "Did I?" The demonic grin had returned. The intruder suddenly dropped his weapon. He grabbed his chest in pain. "What the fuck?" "I don't." "What the fuck did you?" The man was stopped short as his eyes and mouth began to bleed. Though the man showed no signs of gunshot wounds, the blood spewed from not only his eyes and mouth, but ears, nose, and even fingertips. It appeared as if the man had exploded internally, and this reality-defying event offered him a few seconds to make his peace. However, his seconds were over, and he collapsed lifelessly to the ground. Scott's breath became heavy as strain took hold. His eyes calmed and returned to their normal color. Suddenly, he began blinking as if waking from a trance and looked down at the corpse in front of him. It happened again, he thought as he steadied his breath. The last thing Scott could remember was standing up before everything went black. Charlie had told him once. "Charlie," he turned both his body and attention back to his partner. "Come on, let's get the fuck out of here." He removed his coat, covered Charlie, then squatted and lifted him up. Charlie moaned in pain from being disturbed, but Scott ignored his cries and ran out the door, leaving the room in utter disarray. If there was anything important left behind, he would have to deal with it later. Without his coat, and in the hall lighting, it was possible to see that Scott wore a black short-sleeved turtleneck, which clung tightly to his body. Fastened over his shirt and shoulders was a dual gun and magazine holster. A black belt held up his dark blue jeans, which in turn tucked into a pair of black combat boots. The mysterious weapon and its holster were missing. Scott ran down the 2 flights of stairs and past the motel check-in. "You might want to clean up room 208. The sooner, the better," he hollered as he ran out the entrance. About 4 blocks from the motel, Scott darted down an alley and then through a back door. The door had a message that read, "Go around," not an entrance to the Black Bird. Scott gave no fucks and unlocked the door by pushing the knob in, then pulling it out, then dragging it up, and finally pushing it back in. It made no sense, but it worked. The door opened to a small break room. He grabbed a tarp that covered a small table and shook it the best he could, while turning left and going up a flight of stairs. Ignoring the first door on his right, he opened the second. Inside to his left was a twin bed, and to his right was an old beat-up, but surprisingly comfortable couch. The walls, which were once navy blue, had turned black and flaked from age and neglect. Books about romance and adventure were stacked in the far left corner on top of a desk. On the same desk was a mirror, which reflected a young woman with pure black hair. She sat with her back to the door and was unaware of Scott's presence. She hummed gently to herself while listening to music and brushing her hair. Scott rolled his eyes at her and draped the tarp over the couch before putting Charlie down. Charlie moaned in pain. The young woman, who was lost in thought, obliviously continued to hum and brush her hair. Scott rolled his eyes again and sighed. He stood up, walked back to the doorway, turned back to the girl, placed his right hand behind him, and proceeded to slam the door as he walked straight towards her. Finally, alerted by the sound and startled by the man she now saw in the reflection, she spun around and was about to scream when Scott placed his right hand over her mouth. He raised the index finger of his left hand to his lip and mimed, "Shush." Her muffled scream transitioned into a bloodthirsty growl as she registered who he was. She slapped his hand out of her face and turned red. Ripping her earbuds out, she stood up and pointed her brush at him like a weapon. These were all reasonable responses. She couldn't believe he would scare her like this, and to top it off, she was currently topless. "Lou, shut up. They're just tits, and it's just me and Charlie." "The fuck, Scott? You scared the shit out of me. Are you aware that there's this new invention called knocking and waiting before you enter a woman's room?" Lou asked sarcastically. "I know, smartass, but I also know you. At least I put a tarp down." Scott walked back towards Charlie. Her anger dissipated as her gaze followed him to the couch. "Holy shit, what happened?" "I don't know. There must have been a struggle, but I wasn't there." Scott withheld the confrontation and shooed out from her. "Can you just help him, please?" "Course." She cleared off the desk and dragged it into the middle of the room. Scott understood and picked up Charlie. Lou grabbed the bloody tarp and put it on the desk as Scott laid him down. He then backed away to give her room. Lou took a moment to look at Charlie's wounds as she put her finger to her chin to think. "So, you're gonna help him with no shirt on, eh? I can get behind this. Kind of makes me wish I was the one who got shot." Scott genuinely smiled with his eyes. Lou looked down and remembered that she was, in fact, still topless. She looked back up at Scott, who proceeded to wink and click the inside of his cheek twice at her, while making two-finger guns which pointed and fired at her right and left breast. She walked over to him with a smile and then decked him across the face. "What the fuck was that for?" "You," Scott grunted and rubbed his cheek. "For scaring me half to death and for being a horny little creep. Now, I need some towels and water. Get a move on." She went over to the dresser next to the bed, pulled out a white shirt, and slid it on as she turned back to him. However, without a bra, you could still see right through. Scott decided to keep that thought to himself. Instead, he did what he was told and walked past her, pouting and moping. "I oughta. That really hurt. I got ejected out of a flying bomb. People should." Scott mumbled to himself as he disappeared into the bathroom on the far right. She ignored him and focused on Charlie.